Hi, my name is Gina Masulo, and I'm excited to introduce our panel, How Newsrooms Can Help Bridge Divides. It's obviously no secret that America is more divided than ever. One side doesn't just disagree with the other side, but actually hates the other side in many cases. And some of these divides are political, the Democrats against Republicans, but there's also divisions across other axes. Maskers versus anti-maxers, country folks versus urban dwellers, people from different socioeconomic groups. We think that newsrooms can be part of solving this problem by bringing people together across differences. So that's what our panel is about. And before we get more into what it's about, I want to tell you a little bit about me, and then I'm going to introduce our other panelists. So I spent 20 years as a journalist in upstate New York, and then I earned my master's and doctorate at Syracuse University. Right now, I'm associate director of the Center for Media Engagement in the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm also an associate professor of journalism there. And I got involved in this because I really care about this issue, about bringing people together, and that's my core area of research. So I'm super excited to introduce our panelists, Alicia Bell and Erica Anderson. Alicia is an organizing manager of Free Press. She has bachelor's and master's degrees from New York University. And at Free Press, she works on a project called Media 2070, which aims for inclusive media ecosystem.
Hey, y'all. And Gina, thank you so much for this introduction. And I'm so excited to be here in this panel and in this space with everyone. My name is Alicia Bell. And the project that Gina mentioned, Media 2070, is it's really something that I feel so passionate about and I'm so excited about. And this work, what we're doing is bringing together folks across all different aspects of society, all across the media industry, but also outside of the media industry, to figure out what is our vision, what is our dream for the future of journalism, what is our dream for the future of media. And so I'm really excited to be here to talk about the way that journalism plays a role in that. And I'm excited about these futures that we're building and co-creating.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Erica, now on to you. I'd like to introduce you to Erica Anderson. She's an engagement journalist and moderator at Spaceship Media, which has a mission to reduce polarization, build communities, and restore trust in journalism. She is also an engagement fellow at the City University of New York's nonprofit news organization that focuses on local accountability news, as well as collaborative newsmaking and underserved communities. She earned her master's degree in social journalism program at CUNY's Graduate Center School of Journalism. And she also received an award for excellence in engagement reporting. Before her pivot to journalism, she was an actor, a producer, and co-founder of Seed and Spark, a crowdfunding platform.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Alicia. It's so nice to be here with both of you, and I feel really honored and also a little nervous in this world, but I feel really passionate about this topic. And as you said, Gina, I pivoted from the film world, where we built a crowdfunding platform that was about democratizing funding for film. And this belief that if we have a more diverse set of stories, we can actually change hearts and minds. So that's how I approached film. And when I pivoted to journalism, it was this goal to do things that happened a bit faster and a bit more direct, and to work with communities more directly. I feel really honored to be here, and that's a little bit about me. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica, for that introduction. So before we get started, I wanted to provide a little background about what we're going to talk about today. So this panel is part of a larger project that the Center for Media Engagement is working on called Connective Democracy. This project is sponsored by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, but Connective Democracy is a new approach to bridging divides. What it really aims to do is identify concrete strategies to get people to talk across differences and understand each other, versus just theorizing about it or talking about it. So we really believe media is a key component of us doing this work. So that brings up the first point that we're going to discuss today. How can newsrooms approach a coverage plan that focuses on what people share in common and presents diverse viewpoints in a way that helps people empathize with each other? Alicia, if I could start with you.
There is so much that newsrooms can do, first off. And I want to talk about why first. One of the things we've been working, before working with Media 2070, I was working on a project called News Voices, which was oriented towards building and strengthening relationships between communities and newsrooms, and ensuring that the power dynamic shifted between who decides the stories and who decides what information folks need. Oftentimes, historically, that's only come from newsrooms. And so this was to shift kind of what say and what power do communities have in creating that. And what we've found in kind of doing that work and what's kind of been excavated in that is that the newsrooms are these creators of culture, and they're these creators of public opinion. And it's not just newsrooms that do that at all. It's also other culture creating industries. It is film, it is entertainment, it is music. But newsrooms and journalism play such a huge role in that, because our newsrooms and our journalists are telling the stories that then create public opinion across different people. And for those who aren't directly related to something, then they are reading news, they're watching news, they're listening to news to figure out what's going on. And that creates public opinion, which creates kind of a common societal culture. And then those cultures are the things that we see leading up to policy and policy decisions, because policy never passes unless there's a culture that allows for that policy to pass. And so for us, it's really important that newsrooms and journalisms play a role in this community building, community creation, because then we also get policy that is in place, that is related to community creation, community safety, community wellness across all communities and all identities. And so I think there's a lot of ways that newsrooms can do this. And one of the first things that starts with is being in relationship with the communities that they're a part of, the communities they're serving. And I know that shifts, right? So for a local, very place-based newsroom, that's a little easier, right? It's a little easier to build out a kind of geography of who is my community. It gets harder as it gets statewide, as it gets national, as it gets international. But there are always folks that are constituents of a newsroom. And it's up to the newsroom to be in relationship with their constituents. Sometimes we call that audience, sometimes we call that community, but it's the people that the newsroom is serving. And being in conversation and being in relationship, an ongoing relationship, even when you don't need a source, even when there's not a story to be told, is the way to figure out what's bubbling up in this community, what's going on, what information do people need, what stories need to be told. And then you get to do that. You do the journalism.
I think I was really responding to something that you said around, who decides and also the power structures. And when I was thinking about this question initially, my first response is, who is the audience for these specific newsrooms? And then does your newsroom reflect that audience? I think oftentimes we have this problem where we're trying to cover issues that we don't have skin in the game and our newsroom doesn't. And I think that shows in our coverage, and it shows in, alienating these people who we're actually trying, to serve. So I think that is, in terms of, how do you approach a coverage plan? Who's covering what neighborhoods? What kind of stories typically get told from those places? And how can you shift that narrative, and really taking responsibility for the pictures that we paint and how we divide people just based on, maybe it's our deadline schedule. But I think it's an old way that we have practiced journalism, which is, going in, what's the sort of, buzzword quote that we can get and then get out because we have to file something. And when we talk about sort of shifting these practices and different engagement and listening, I often hear from sort of more traditional newsrooms, but we don't have time for that. And we don't have the budget for that. And I think this quickly turns into a conversation around business models, but I also just don't by that. I was speaking with a friend of mine about this panel last night, who's a documentary filmmaker, and she was filming in Ethiopia, and she was there with all these BBC journalists, and they were, talking smack and also kind of trading stories. And she was talking to this, older man, and he said, I just don't understand how this woman gets these stories and these perfect anecdotes. And I wish I could write like her. And I wish that I could tell these stories. And my friend said, well, I think she has pretty deep relationships in this community. And it seems like she's been here the same amount of time that you have. And he goes, no, I'm not an artist. I'm just about the facts. It's like, okay, but you're saying you see that her journalism is better. I think just sort of on a practical level, it's also involving the people that you are working for and serving in the process. Asking them, what are the pain points in your life? What keeps you up at night? And having a part of your coverage be obsessed with this kind of listening, and whether that's calling people, texting them, putting call outs at the bottom of every single one of your articles, saying, what other questions do you have? What did this bring up?
Erica, thank you so much. I'm just so delighted that both of you have set up my answer so well, because it's almost like we had a mind meld, because we were all thinking very similar things. As you were talking, Alicia, I was taking some notes, because that relationship you're talking about is so key. And I think we think of that as sort of a new thing, but in some ways it really isn't. It's something good journalists have always done. And, I worked, as I mentioned earlier, a journalist in upstate New York. And this must have been the early 90s, pre-social media, the internet was invented, but nobody had it yet. And I was covering these 6 towns that are around Syracuse, New York. I had this wonderful editor, Dave Berman, and he let me do this thing that I called a wandering day, which was I basically just wandered around my coverage area and talked to people. There was no agenda. I don't have to get a story out of it. And it was a rural area. So I just hung out with people in like corner stores and dive bars. That's honestly what I did. I just pull up to a dive bar and I go in and just chat with these farmers. And the most amazing story I did get out of that was that Agway had figured out a way to make manure not smell that bad, because, there's a lot of cows in upstate New York, but there was also a lot of development of new houses. And the people buying those houses weren't farmers. They were, suburbanites who did not want it to smell like the country. And it ended up being a front page story, but the point was I was building relationships that served me through my whole beat. And I think in the crisis in journalism and the cost cutting and the loss of the business model, some of that got lost. That relationship is something good reporters did back in the day. And they have so many more avenues to do it now. The other thing I wanted to address, what Erica was saying, about, and I've had reporters say this to me too, well, we don't have the time to do it, right? We don't have the time to do it. And people said that at the same time, back in the early 90s, when I was doing this wandering day, my colleagues thought I was like off my rocker, like, what is she doing? And honestly, I think the other editors do. And I credit my editor who had the faith and the foresight to let me do this. But I just can't stop thinking that we cannot afford not to do this, because you can't replace that relationship. It's the reason people tell you their story. So a couple other things I wanted to throw in there is, I also think, and this is also kind of an old chestnut, but we really have to start doing it, is to diversify newsrooms. And I don't mean just doing it to hit some kind of quota, to really do it thoughtfully and to diversify them by race, by age, by gender, by socioeconomics, by political beliefs, by all different axes. Because the fact is, people are more comfortable talking to reporters who they feel are somewhat like them, right? We know that women reporters are more likely to interview women. male reporters are more likely to interview men. It's not really a bad thing. It's just the way human beings are made. The same thing happens along racial lines. The same thing happens on socioeconomic lines. So the more diverse our newsrooms are, and if we really take it seriously, I mean, I've been hearing that since I got in the business, and I've yet to see that actually happen. Like, I keep hearing that we're going to do it, but we never do. So I think that is important, but that's not going to fix the problem alone. We also, as journalists, have to seek out people who are different from the normal people we talk to. And I'll tell you a really quick story about my dad to give you an example of what I mean. At one point, the local newspaper found him. And, you know, my dad's the type of guy, he can talk pretty much on any topic. You can be like, hey, what do you think about this? And he'll have an opinion. You know, and that's a reporter's dream, right? It goes right into what we used to call the Rolodex. Now it goes into your cell phone, right? But the problem is reporters can over rely on that type of person. So that person gets popped up. You know, you have your one black source you always go to. Well, that's great, but that person shouldn't be your one black source. Or you have your one, you know, person who represents this point of view. And that it maybe the first time you quote them, it's good, but then it just becomes lazy. You should be asking other people. And I think that's important. And those diverse voices need to be infused throughout the coverage. You know, you don't want it to be like, oh, well, you know, this one reporter handles that group and nobody else can talk to that group because that's their thing. Because then if that reporter isn't doing the story, you don't get those voices in the story. And so I think it's important to be infused throughout the coverage and really make it part of the coverage every day.
Yeah, Gina, you know, and you were talking about that relationship piece and how it shouldn't always have been your dad. It reminds me of one of the things that we talk to newsrooms about all the time is creating this relational spiral, right? So you have this person, like maybe you're really good at building relationships with X group of people, or maybe you're good at reaching the grass tops leaders, the people who are already really visible. But the thing you always have to do before leaving that conversation is ask them who else you should be talking to. So maybe you know who the pastor is at a church, but you ask them, are there any of your congregation who I can speak to? And then you ask them, do you have any siblings that don't go to this church? Do you have any family or friends? And then that creates a spiral that gets you out further from where you know. And it also means that you can start anywhere. It doesn't mean that it's an indictment on who you know or don't know right now, because none of us know everyone. We can only manage a certain amount of relationships. But what we can do is always be asking who else we should be speaking to. And that spiral, it reminds me of one of the things that feels so important and really core to this work around journalism for me is that really at its best, journalism should be and could be a community center. That at its best, journalism is a place where people see each other, they weave together, they share story, they share food, they share art, they share upcoming events. But I don't think I know that there's a lot of instances where that's not the case, where journalism isn't existing and newsrooms aren't existing as community centers. And one of the things that comes up so often is that it's because the idea of community is nebulous. So when we ask newsrooms, when we ask journalists all the time, who is your community? So many people have no answer for that. They can tell you who their audience is. If it's a membership-based newsroom, they can tell you who their members are, who their donors are, who their donor base is, but they can't really tell you who their community is. And I find that it's the newsrooms who are able to define their community who are the best then at moving towards being a community center.
Thank you. Erica, did you have anything you wanted to add before we jump on?
Yeah, and I think this sort of leads in a little bit, so I'll save some of what I was going to say, but I love this idea of a wandering day so much. And when I was first starting in journalism, I had a professor ask me, how long can you go into a community without taking out your notepad or trying to write a story? How long can you spend somewhere so that it's not this sort of extraction journalism? And I think just thinking about you versus some of your colleagues who were like, what are you doing? This is a waste of time. And it feels like part of this is curiosity, and that curiosity gets lost. And I think some of that is out of panic for journalists who like, I have so many deadlines, like I don't have time to do that. And I think that sort of fear and, the fear shuts down the part of our brain that can be curious. And I think the other piece is that journalism has to be about these relationships and growing these relationships. And I think a lot of us have to question now, why are we doing this? Why are we in this? And there is definitely glory in writing, an article that gets picked up and you get awards for it. But I think if we can return to the sort of heart of journalism, which is this curiosity about people and the service aspect of that, of like, if you are actually interested in other people's lives and what is happening to them, the stories are endless that can come out of that. And I think the more we can return to this idea of community and relationships and curiosity, those seem like buzzwords, but like that's like the heart of, I think, how we continue as an industry.
Thanks, Erica. Let's tackle our second question. How can newsrooms frame stories in a way that offer people the news they need rather than emphasize political infighting or even write headlines that focus on the solutions to the problems?
So I return to this piece by the Solutions Journalism Network over and over and over again, and it's around complicating the narrative. And this is looking at the way that we write stories and who we quote and how we tell those things. And that in these really polarized times, our tendency is to seek simplicity and order, that we're all sort of panicked. And we do it in our writing, we do it in our relationships. But when we can actually complicate and bring nuance to the stories that we're telling, that's where people can actually open up a little bit more of that curiosity. And in this same article, they talk about literally the way our brain works when we feel like we're under threat. And the piece of our brain needed to take in new information and to be curious doesn't actually work at all when it feels like it's under threat, which I think it's not typically something we think about in journalism. And I think as journalists, we tend, whether it goes against some of our metrics for success to not be super transparent in our methods, to write those headlines that may be dramatic, that will get people to click. But it's thinking about, who are we alienating when we write something in a certain way, whether it's as simple as a headline. And I think it's coming from this place of humility, that we aren't the gatekeepers of information anymore. We are the people who have the time to go and investigate concerns of people. And it's our job to come back and paint a realistic picture. And so we spend a lot of time at Spaceship figuring out, how do we talk across those differences, and how do we not alienate people, and how we as a news organization, do we bring people together? So it's not just with our articles or our videos, but how are we actually creating spaces where our community can come together and have civil conversations? And then what are the stories that come out of that we could focus on? And I think one other piece that I really have taken from more solutions based is figure out where it's working and who's doing that work on the ground. So covering sort of difficult, divisive, wicked problems, as they say, through the lens of, where are people actually doing something that's working, and how can we focus on that? And not, trying to make it rainbows and unicorns, but this is a way to look at this so that people read an article and say, like, okay, homelessness in New York City and, in the NYCHA housing complexes, that's a huge problem. But rather than, leaving someone with just this completely deflated feeling, it's very different when you cover that through, the organization of moms who are fighting on the ground to get housing for, for people in their neighborhood, and creating neighborhood associations. And maybe that's really small, but you're seeing those bits of change work. And I think it's how we choose to cover things, and not just sort of going straight to the drama that makes a good story. I think it's, figuring out where there's more nuance.
Oh my goodness, so many things. Erica, yes, all of that. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Solutions Journalism Network, because they are just so excellent, such excellent partners. I'm so thankful for the work that they're doing. When, that this question of framing in a way that meets needs and isn't kind of isolating. I think it starts with one of those questions we were asking before of the relationship. You have to figure out who needs what. So I think about an issue like homelessness, for example, and the information in the news that folks who are maybe living in a tent city need is different than the news and information than people who are organizing around that issue and advocating for that issue. And that news is even different from people who don't have to drive by or interact with the tent city on a regular basis. And those are different stories. And so those stories all need to be told, because we need each of those folks to be able to be in their power, with their people, with their communities, to try to create shift and try to create something better. And so I think as much as this piece around polarization and isolation is around who newsrooms and journalists are in relationship with, it's also about facilitating relationships amongst a community and amongst a network and an ecosystem that exists around any political issue, any communal issue, any safety, wellness issue. That there's always an ecosystem there. And those people are always connected. So even the folks who are as like anti an issue and the folks who are most for an issue, if you map out those relationships, at some point they connect. And so figuring out how to facilitate those relationships is really key. I think that the other piece that comes up is, and I think this is one of there's this really terrible cycle that exists, right? And I talked a little bit before about how journalism and other kind of culture-creating, culture-shifting industries and sectors create culture and create the policy floor, where the forest floor where policy happens. But the other thing is that I think we've gotten so used to policy that is based in concession and based in scarcity. And so there is a culture that is spread out from all of that. And I'll have to thank the folks. There's this really incredible organization, Liberation Ventures, who I have to thank for their thought partnership in this, because this was not at all me just sitting around by myself. But it was being in conversation with them that helped me realize that when our policies and our governance is concession based, it creates polarization, because it creates this mindset and this culture where we don't all get and we can't all get what we deserve to live, and what we need to live. When in reality, we have the resources, we have the technology, we have the brilliance, we have the innovation to have all of our needs met. And we have the things we need. And so I think if we want policy, if we want governance, if we want culture, if we want society that works from this framework and this understanding that we can and deserve to have our needs met and we deserve to be well, then we also need to create journalism and write stories and work with communities and tell the stories that create that culture. What is the journalism that tells the story that all these needs can be met? We may not have figured it out yet. We may have to do some different configurations of thought partnering, of research and design, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means that we haven't done it yet.
Oh, thank you so much, Alicia. That is really, I just love that. I just love all of that. I'm going to address my answer to the journalists who I hope are going to ultimately be listening to this, who might be sitting there saying, okay, this is all well and good, but news focuses on conflict because conflict is newsworthy. And I remember, early in my career, people calling the newspaper and saying, back when people used the telephone for something like calling and saying, why don't you ever do some good news? That's not really what we're talking about here. I mean, yes, we want to do good news, but that's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is how you're framing stories that even are bad news. So, for example, research clearly shows that when news stories focus on the fight and not the issue, that it has bad ramifications. So in other words, if the news story focuses on the conflict between, say, the Democrats and Republicans about a particular issue versus the issue itself, it makes people think that our society is more polarized than it is. And it is pretty polarized, but they think it's even worse. And why is that bad? Because it makes people disengage. It makes them say, why bother? Everything's a mess. They all are awful. Why should I get involved in this if there's no hope? It also, and this alludes to what Erica was saying earlier about the solutions journalism, it also is emotionally and mentally exhausting, right? Your brain shuts off when you're under crisis. I think that is a really good thing to keep in mind. And when people are exhausted, they're not learning from us. And that's a problem. They're looking at a spectacle. Now, they may be entertained and they may share those stories, right? In the same way that people will rubberneck at a car accident, but that's not really what we want. And the other problem with it is when the news focuses on the fight and not the issue can get lost. And a good example of this is coronavirus. At the Center for Media Engagement, we have done some research on this. And, I first want to say lots of coverage of coronavirus has been wonderful and helpful. But we focused on local news coverage across the country that was shared on Facebook, and we compared it to surveys of what people wanted to know about the coronavirus at 3 points during the pandemic. And what we found was really startling was that the coverage focused on really the bad stuff of businesses closing and the economy collapsing. And what the public wanted was stuff more of what, like Erica was saying, news you can use. Like, how do I know if this thing is true about masks or about the vaccine or about how it spreads? And how is my grocery store responding? Where can I get toilet paper? Like, that's what the public wanted to know. And we call this gap the crisis coverage gap. But really what it is it's a failure of news organizations to serve their readers at a time when the stakes of not serving them are deadly. But that same kind of thing can play out with other issues, political stories. Immigration is a good example. If the stories focus only on the fact that one side is yelling these crazy things at the other side and doesn't focus on the issue, the bigger issue of immigration, what can get lost is why they're even arguing. Right? There's a lot of drama and it might get shared a lot, but people miss the point that there is an immigration issue in our country, that there is a big problem and that there's ways to solve it. So that's one thing I really want to underscore is we are not saying stop covering things that are bad, because obviously news is often bad. Like, we don't want you to just, we don't want, as Erica said, unicorns and rainbows. I mean, that's not what we're saying. But we're saying, but as you frame it, don't focus on the spectacle of the conflict to the exclusion of the issues, the underlying issues.
Wanted to say too, sort of speaking to those journalists, that for a lot of these things, it's not asking people to do a lot more work. Sometimes it's just shifting the focus. Obviously we have to cover conflict. We have to bring, amplify voices that are not getting heard. And that's usually when they're getting screwed over in some way. That is crucial to our job. But I think, if you do a big piece on immigration, for instance, you've done enough reporting to also write a couple of explainers that go at the bottom. If this is a specific issue that you're dealing with, here are the places that you can go. Here are some things that people have found that have been particularly helpful. Here's who we talked to for this piece. And I think, combining sort of larger, whether they're features or kind of these bigger pieces with news you can use, you've already done the reporting. And so it's just sort of packaging things differently, again, to sort of speak to this ecosystem. And if you're aware of all of the different people who this issue affects, then you write or you make something for each one of those parties, and also figuring out, again, how do you bring them together in some way so that the people living in the tent city are not the enemies of the people who drive by. And the activists are not just, lunatics who are working against a problem that will never be fixed.
Thanks, Erica. Alicia, did you have anything you wanted to follow up with?
Yeah, this conversation, kind of distilling it down into something that feels tangible for folks, it makes me think of two things, at least. The Equal Rights Amendment and crime coverage, which maybe don't seem related, but I'll tell you why they make me think of them. So there was recently this TV series, Miss America, that kind of was a covering of the Equal Rights Amendment. And the thing that came up in it, and one of the things that happened in real life when folks were organizing around the ERA, was that some of the opposition to the ERA was women who wanted to be housewives and homemakers and felt like their livelihoods were at risk because of the ERA. And folks use that, right? That was political capital that people used to get votes against and for things, and used to move into other issues. At the same time, though, around the same time, not the exact same time, there was also a movement that was happening and some activism that was going on under this campaign of wages for housework. The Wages for Housework campaign was perceived as this radical leftist campaign. And it was women, it was homekeepers, homemakers who were like, this is labor and I need to get paid for it because this is real work. And so one of the things, my partner and I we were watching this and we were talking about that, and we were like, but what if there was someone who was able to bring these things together and say, you want to be a housewife, you want wages for housework, these are the same thing, actually. But instead, what happened was because of bad players, that never happened. And there were no stories that came out to say what is the connection between these folks? What are the similar things that folks want out of this? And instead, it became people kind of fighting against each other's livelihoods. I think about that a lot because that just comes up so often where there is this political spectrum, and that at some point in different places in it bows towards each other. And I think there's a lot of missed opportunity when those bows happen, to say what are the things that are connective tissue here, which does go back to that, how do we create and tell stories about everyone being able to have what they need and to be well. And then the other thing I mentioned was the crime reporting and crime coverage. I think about the work that Danielle Killian has done. And so she's this researcher and writer, and she's been doing work for a long time around police coverage and crime coverage. And one of the things that she talks about is that oftentimes crime coverage makes everyone unsafe, and it makes everyone feel unsafe, right? So it creates these narratives oftentimes where Black and brown folks are at risk of lack of safety, right? Because there is a perception, there are policing mechanisms that are created that target Black and brown folks that say you are the holders and the perpetuators of crime. But at the same time, it creates this fear and lack of safety amongst white folks who aren't Black and brown, to say these are the people to be scared of. And what that means is that when folks are running into each other and seeing each other, there's no community there. There's no perception of safety, because there are people who are at risk, and there are people who feel at risk, and all of that has to do with the same narrative, and it all has to do with the programs and policies that get created because of those narratives. And so much of her work is about how do we create less fear, and how do we actually, that question earlier, how do we get people the news and information they need without creating the fear that divides and separates a community. And what that does is that it shifts the culture, it shifts the narrative, so that Black and brown folks don't have to be in fear of our lives. And it also creates a situation where white folks are not in fear of their lives, because of Black and brown folks. And so thinking about how we transition and how we transform crime coverage, I think, is one of those instances. And it is one of the why we work in it. It's juicy, it's messy, it's a lot. But I do think it is one of those access points that has so much ability to shift how we perceive each other and how we build community into the future.
Thank you, Alicia. That brings us to our third and final question. How can newsrooms use social media to connect people to their newsroom and their community rather than amplify divisions? So my answer to this is it's a tricky one. Social media are certainly vital to newsrooms. They're a way to reach your audience. They help you get stories out to people who might not see them otherwise, but they can be dangerous places. My suggestions with it is it's important not to ignore your community, especially if they criticize you. And that's hard to do. I mean, who wants to engage with someone who's criticizing you? But it is a way to bridge a divide. If your newspaper or your TV station makes a mistake or a reader questions something, giving a straightforward answer without being defensive is helpful. Easier said than done. If you ignore them, everybody sees you ignoring them. And that's not a good look. However, this is really advice for criticism. It is not for abuse and harassment. And for those people you can't engage, you need to remove them if it's on your site. And I also, I've done a lot of research in the space, and I want to just underscore a call that I think newsrooms need to do more to protect their own employees from that harassment. And I think if they did more and they had structures in place where particularly women and people of color felt comfortable coming to an editor and saying, this is what's happening to me, and they wouldn't be worried they're going to be branded a problem for bringing that question or that challenge up, I think then journalists would have an easier time actually answering the legitimate criticism that goes on in social media, because they know the newsroom has their back if things go really badly. So the bottom line is, I think social media can be this vital link, but newsrooms have an obligation to protect their employees if things get harassing and abusive, as they often do.
Full disclosure, I have a complicated relationship with social media. I feel like it's like sometimes an abusive relationship that I have to cut off completely. But I think part of that is born out of my own panic and again, the sort of success metrics of is the story, is the piece getting enough retweets, and are people paying attention to it? And when I can dial that back and say, if I don't perceive social media as a distribution arm for journalism, and I see it more as a relationship tool, it really changes the game for me. And I think I couldn't agree more with you, Gina, about newsrooms supporting their staff in terms of engaging on social media, and also, in comments. I think having a very clear set of rules of engagement of what will and won't be tolerated, and having no problem being that's not the kind of that's not what we're looking for. We are looking for, engagement and discussion and people respecting one another. And I think it takes some time. And I think it also depends on the platform, and while comments aren't exactly social media, I think opening up comments on specific articles is really important, but having those be moderated really specifically and not putting up with bullies in there. But if you can create sort of a healthy relationship and a well-moderated one on your social media platforms, they're an incredible place to form a relationship with people. And that means getting better stories, getting better sources, and really using it as an extension of your humanity and of you being a human on these platforms. And I think for newsrooms, it's also figuring out what are the different ways that we can do this. Are we just tweeting out our stories, or are we breaking down a more complicated story into a Twitter thread that's, sort of easily digestible, and not just thinking of social media as a way of this is just to get people back to our platform, but how do we really kind of honor what each of these different platforms, what their strengths are, and where different people like to get their news. So Twitter has sort of one language and one way of relating. Facebook has another. I think Facebook groups, public and private, can be really interesting in terms of creating community that then comes back to your newsroom. I'm working with a group of women right now at an organization called Reckon South, and it's all about sort of the changing, what they're covering, kind of what does the South look like as it's changing or not changing. And they have a private Facebook group just for women. And every day it's posted in and moderated by a different journalist from Reckon. And it is absolutely incredible the change we've started to see when the moderators start to shift their posts to really ask questions and to get the women talking, not necessarily, looking for stories or looking for sources, but those inevitably come up in the comments. And then those women get taken and interviewed, and stories are written around them. And then those articles get posted back into the Facebook group. And you really start to see this sort of this relationship form. And it's really, really cool to watch. And you see the sort of love that this group has for these journalists and for this journalism organization, because they feel really seen. And I think that is an interesting way to use social media that's not just, we're just distributing our articles and a metric of like, do they come back to the site or not?
I think this piece around relationship building on social media, I think it should be no surprise that I'm going to say like, yes, that. Because that has been so core to all of this, and is so core to all of this. And I think there's a lot that balance between criticism, abuse, and harassment, I think is so key. Because on the criticism piece, right, when we've worked with newsrooms to bring them into conversation with community, sometimes we have to do these like pep rallies of sorts with the journalist, right? To be like, you're gonna hear some things that are hard. It's not always gonna be great. People might be mad at you, but like you can do it. And we talk through kind of how to facilitate those things and how to respond to things that folks say. And inevitably, out of every single one of those conversations, every single journalist we've worked with in those spaces has been like, more of this, like more of these kinds of conversations, more of these community conversations and these relationships. And there hasn't been a time, even when folks have been critical, there hasn't been a time where we had journalists and newsrooms leave the space feeling like deflated and defeated and like this is not possible. Every single time it was generative. That's not the same for abuse and harassment, right? And we do see that play out so differently in social media than we do in real life, in these kind of even Zoom conversations or in-person conversations or whatever that looks like. And I think there's so much to learn. There's a long lineage of folks who have been doing work in this realm called transformative justice. And in transformative justice, folks have done a lot of work to name like, what is abuse? What is harassment? What is conflict? How is conflict different than abuse and harassment? And how do we stop one thing without letting this thing kind of be stopped as well? And so I think there's a lot that journalism can learn from transformative justice advocates and organizers. And part of that has to do with the fact that even if we want to transform folks who have been abusive, who have been harmful, that doesn't have to happen in a space that jeopardizes the safety of the folks they're harming, and the folks that they're harassing and abusing. And it doesn't mean that those things can't coexist. It just means that they don't have to happen in the same space. One of the things that we hear from community members all the time, and it comes up, and I think earlier we were talking about trust in news and trust in journalism, is that folks are way more likely to trust journalism and trust the news if the news trusts them. So when folks come and say, this is harming me and my people and my community, then you have to believe them and figure out what is it about that. Because if you just continue to tell people they're lying to you, then they have no reason to trust you. I think really kind of coming back to these real human needs and ways of interacting and moving and building trust is really key in figuring out how we navigate social media.
We're going to get ready to wrap up now. So what do you wish you had a chance to say that you didn't have a chance to say yet? And I'm going to start with you, Alicia.
I think just the core of this is the thing that feels so important to me is to know that there are futures of journalism, there are futures of media ecosystems where all folks are thriving and all folks are well. And I hear that every single time I lead journalists, community members, media makers of other sorts through a visioning or dreaming exercise. The dreams and the visions that get created are very similar and they're very possible. And so I think that it's on us now to figure out what are the things we can learn from the past, what are the changes that we can make today, so that we can create those futures where everyone is well and everyone thrives. And it's gonna take some hard decisions, some hard shifts, some things that may be uncomfortable. But if on the other side of that is everyone being okay, of Black and brown folks being safe, of women, non-binary folks, trans folks being safe, of people across identities being well, for maybe the first time in the history of our country, then it's worth it. And that's a future that I'm excited about.
Amen, Alicia. I think a couple of things that we've touched on or that have come up a couple of times that, right now we're reporting on issues that are life and death for people. And I think that's always been the case, but I think especially with the coronavirus and, around our racial equity, all of those conversations, but those are like, it's front and center. And I think there's a lot of pressure on journalists and there's a lot of criticism of journalists about what they're doing wrong and how they're perpetuating misinformation and not doing their jobs. They could be doing better. And I think one thing I just wanted to say is that, journalists are living through the coronavirus as well. And journalists are living through, these insane times. And I think just stepping back and being able to be like, okay, I understand this place of sort of writing out of that panic and needing to file stories, needing to feel like I'm doing something, because all of us feel so powerless right now. And what I hope people can get from this panel is that we're not saying change everything that you're doing. It's, there is another way and it's not that different from what you're doing now. And it's not a bunch more work. But also, acknowledging that it's on editors and higher ups in these journalism organizations to give people more time, to give people more support, to not make journalists have to defend themselves online. So those places could be somewhere where journalists are like, you know what? Totally, I didn't see that part. And that's an excellent place for me to do a follow-up piece on this, rather than having to get super defensive because they're worried about their job. So I think just like having a little bit of, breath and pause and gratitude for the work that, reporters and journalists are doing right now. And just this sort of nudge of like, it will also be more satisfying to do journalism in a different way. If we can kind of see this future that Alicia was talking about, like I want to live in that future and I want to participate in a system that is moving towards that. And I can't imagine anyone would be like, nah, I'm good. I want to keep it the way it is, so like it just takes time and encouragement and these sort of positive reinforcements and like not just saying, don't do that, but here's this other way.
Thank you so much, Erica. As I wrap up, what keeps coming to me is a quote from Gabriel Détard, who was a sociologist from France, and he lived in the 1800s, died in the early part of the 1900s, which I think is informative. But what he said was that newspapers' role was to bring the dispersed crowds together. And it resonates so much with what we're talking about, that it's new, but it's old. Like this is the role. I mean, he was talking about newspapers. Obviously, there was no TV then. We mean this about all news media, but bringing those dispersed crowds together is part of what our role as journalists should be. And I think that it's not antithetical to being a journalist to care about bridging these divides and connecting people across difference and making that society that Alicia so eloquently described that I also want to live in. I think it's not something that's like, oh, that's something we shouldn't be doing. It's always been sort of what we should be doing. And I think we just have to sort of reawaken that in ourselves. With that, I thank you, Alicia Bell and Erica Anderson, so much for taking the time to share your thoughts and your knowledge and your joy with us around this topic. And I'm super excited to hear the response to this panel. And with that, we will close it. Thank you so much.